Hi, I'm Dan Smola, and welcome to Featured Favorites, a new program from the Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library, in which we ask people to discuss their favorite items, a few of their favorite items in the library. So I'm very happy to present our first guest ever on the program, editor of Quest Magazine and author Richard Smoley. And so, Richard, I see you've gathered a few books from our Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library collection.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me. Let me go through some of these. Here's one I'll start out with, which is an introductory work to the Kabbalah. It's written by a friend of mine named Warren Kenton, who writes under the pen name Zev Ben Shimon Halevi. And it's a very good street-level introduction to the teachings of the mystical Jewish tradition known as the Kabbalah. It has various diagrams which show the tree of life, which is one of the standard Kabbalistic diagrams, and shows how these principles work out in day-to-day life. So anyone who's looking for a very good, readable, street-level introduction to a very, very obscure subject would find this very helpful.
All right.
So here's another book written by a theosophist, Annie Besant, and this book goes back 110 years. I think it was first published in 1901, Esoteric Christianity. And it's a guide to Christianity as seen in a deeper sense, as not as something that happened a long time ago to some man, but as a process of regeneration and self-development that can happen to any of us. And it's a very useful, still very readable book despite its age. And it's really gives a totally new picture of Christianity than one is normally gets. So, good. And this is something totally different. This is a book called An Introduction to Phenomenology, which is a very obscure subject. It's a school of 20th century philosophy that discusses how things appear to us. That is to say, what exactly do things look like and how do we perceive them in the world? And there are various great thinkers who pioneered in this, Edmund Husserl, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and others. This is written by Robert Sokolowski, and this is just a really, again, very basic street-level introduction to this subject. It's really the only book of phenomenology I've ever found readable or accessible. So if you want to delve into what's a very obscure in some ways but very influential part of philosophy, I'd recommend that.
Okay, that's great.
Here's a book, going in no particular order here, called The Consciousness of the Atom by Alice Bailey. And this is a very short book written in the 1920s, and it basically explains that consciousness is not something that's limited to human consciousness, that it's a principle that pervades everything. And even the atom, even apparently inanimate things, have a measure or degree of consciousness. It quotes Thomas Edison, who said in an 1890 interview, look at how all these atoms react with one another and to form these marvelous and intricate substances. Do you mean to say they do this without some form of consciousness? And this book by a well-known esoteric authority, Alice Bailey, who's part of the theosophical tradition, is a good way of delving into this subject. It's much more accessible and, again, street level than one might think given its obscure subject matter. Here's a somewhat more difficult book, but it's called Meditations on the Tarot. It's published anonymously, but it was written by a Russian esotericist named Valentin Tomberg, who died in 1973. And it contains a great deal on what are called the major arcana of the Tarot, the 21 cards that are called the greater trumps, which include such things as the Fool, the Hermit, the Devil, the Emperor, the Empress. And this book has detailed discussion of each of these cards, and it's kind of a hidden classic of modern esotericism. It's not perhaps for a beginner on the Tarot, but for anyone who's interested in this kind of subject and wants to go a little bit deeper into the whole symbolism of the Tarot would find this very useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And here's one called Sacred Geometry, which is kind of a workbook. It explores geometry not only from the point of view of kind of the axioms and corollaries and whatnot that we learned about in grade school or high school, but what the sacred symbolism behind a lot of these symbols are. For example, what's known as the Vesica Piscis, which is where two circles intersect. I don't think I'll be able to find it here terribly quickly, and I'm not sure you'd be able to see it if I could. But these principles and these symbols are the basis of many, many things, ranging from Islamic symbolic art to the design of the cathedrals to really pretty much any kind of sacred symbolism that you're likely to find. And this book is a guide to the very basics of the symbolism, and also gives you step-by-step instructions about how to draw some of these symbols yourself. So it's a very practical and hands-on book as well. This last one is probably the densest of them all, and this is a weird book called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson by the great spiritual teacher G.I. Gurdjieff. And this is a kind of work of fiction. Beelzebub is not a devil, and you can remember Beelzebub is a devil in the New Testament, but in this one Beelzebub is not a devil, but kind of a respected member of the senior cosmic hierarchy. He's kind of an extraterrestrial, and he pays various visits to Earth throughout the course of the Earth's history, ranging from the time of Babylon and ancient Egypt down to, well, if not the present, say the 1920s, which is when this book was written. And it's an elaborate, kind of fantastic, somewhat allegorical, somewhat symbolic history of the human race. It contains a lot of very deep information, and it's also quite humorous and quite funny. It's sometimes thought to be unreadable, but it's more readable than it's often said to be. And it's sort of peppered with Gurdjieff's own very bizarre kind of Caucasian sense of humor, and it gives a great deal of flavor of the spirituality, not only of Gurdjieff, but of that part of the world.
Okay.
So these are just a few things that I thought the readers might find of interest, some of them very basic, some of them a little bit more advanced, but they're all worth checking out and exploring more deeply.
Just real briefly, outstanding summary. I want to ask you a couple, to use your phrase, street level reading questions, if it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So how many books do you read at a time? Just in your own, for fun, for whatever.
Usually like one or two.
One or two?
One or two, maybe.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes I will stop and sometimes I get bogged down in something and pick up something else and then pick up the first one, weeks later.
Okay.
But right now, what am I reading? I'm reading a book by the Dalai Lama called Beyond Religion, which has just come out.
Okay.
And it's his guide to secular ethics, kind of ethics that everybody could live by, not just people of various religions.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting.
And do you remember when you first got interested in reading esoteric spirituality, for lack of a better term? Do you remember sort of what got you into reading this sort of material? Has it always been as long as you can remember?
Well, there have certainly been times when I was more interested in it than not. For a lot of my adolescence, I wasn't too interested in it. But around the time I was my senior year in college, I began to be drawn more toward these subjects.
Okay.
One book I read, which I don't know if is in the Alcott Library or not, is E.J. Gould's American Book of the Dead, which is a retelling of the famous Tibetan Book of the Dead for American audiences.
Okay.
And it's kind of eccentric and in some ways kind of zany book, but it's also quite profound and pretty insightful.
Yeah.
The Tibetan Book of the Dead was another book I read fairly soon thereafter, and that's a classic that I think a lot of people who are interested in spirituality at least delved into at one point or another.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of the things that I looked at. The various Kabbalistic works. Dion Fortune, who was a famous British occultist or esotericist of the early 20th century, wrote a book called The Mystical Kabbalah that was published in the 30s that I also found very influential.
Yeah. Okay. Well, outstanding. I really like your presentation because it shows not just the variety of your own interests, which I know you do go in many directions, but also our library. So we invite you to check out some of these titles or just check out the Olcott Library in general. And again, Richard Smalley, thank you for your time.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.